All right, today we are diving deep into the history of Brazil. And look, this is a story that goes way beyond just samba and soccer. We're talking about accidental empires, mind-boggling riches, and this really intense, constant struggle for identity.
So let's just start with a quick question, just to get us going. When I say Brazil, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Is it samba? Soccer? Maybe? The Amazon rainforest?
Yeah, those things are part of it, for sure. But the real story? It is a wild ride. It's this epic saga of conquest, unbelievable wealth, constant rebellion, and this incredible forging of a unique identity against all odds. So, let's do this. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, before the place we know as Brazil even had that name.
Okay, so, Section 1, Brazil before Brazil, a land of millions. Now, it's super important to get this right from the start. Before the first Europeans showed up in 1500, this land was absolutely not some empty paradise waiting to be discovered. Nope. It was a buzzing, complex world already home to millions of people.
And when I say millions, I mean it. We're talking an estimated 5 million people. To put that in perspective, that's more people than were living in all of Portugal at that exact same time. And this wasn't just one big monolithic group. It was this incredible, stunningly diverse mosaic of over 1,200 tribes, speaking something like 1,400 different languages. Just imagine that.
A lot of these societies were really different from what the Europeans were used to. They were often egalitarian, pretty decentralized, and they had this worldview that saw humans as just one part of nature, not its masters. And that legacy, it's still alive and kicking in modern Brazil. You can see it in the food, like with manioc, which is a staple, and even in everyday habits, like showering a lot. Seriously, the first Europeans were completely amazed by how often indigenous people bathe. It's a little thing, but it shows how deep those roots go.
But then the Portuguese arrived, and what followed was nothing short of a devastating genocide. And it was carried out with really 3 main tools of conquest. First, you had the weapons, firearms, cannons, which created a totally unfair fight. Then came the diseases, things like smallpox, which the indigenous people had zero immunity to, just ripped through communities and wiped them out. And finally, there was religion. Catholic missionaries came in and systematically suppressed native languages and beliefs, trying to erase entire cultures.
Okay, so that brings us to the next phase, the colony's golden cage. This is a story all about extraction and enslavement. For the next 300 years, Brazil was essentially transformed into a colony built for one single purpose, to generate massive amounts of wealth, but none of it was for the people actually living there.
The colonial economy was like this relentless engine, just constantly extracting resources. It jumped from one boom to the next. First up was Brazil wood. That's the reddish tree that actually gave the country its name, pau-brasil. Then it was all about these huge sugar plantations. After that, cotton had its moment. Then coffee. And then the big one, gold.
And yeah, nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the gold rush. Let's just try to wrap our heads around this number. The gold that was taken from regions like Minas Gerais, if you convert that to today's money, it would be worth an estimated $73 billion. That is just an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth being shipped out of the country.
And, of course, this incredible wealth came at a truly brutal human cost. It created this vicious cycle of exploitation that, as the quote here says, literally enslaved people with their own wealth. And you know what's crazy? That cycle continues to haunt these same regions even today, with things like destructive mining practices. The past isn't even past.
And let's be crystal clear about how this wealth was generated. It was all built on the backs of enslaved people. Brazil became the single largest destination in the entire horrific history of the transatlantic slave trade. We're talking over 4 million enslaved Africans forcibly brought to Brazil. That number is staggering. It's more than any other country in the Americas, and that fact has profoundly, deeply shaped the nation's identity right up to the present day.
All right, now we get to one of the wildest, most surprising twists in this whole story. How did Brazil get its independence? You'd think it was a big, bloody local rebellion, right? Wrong. The whole thing was kicked off accidentally by Napoleon Bonaparte causing absolute chaos thousands of miles away in Europe. So, here's what happened. In 1807, Napoleon threatens Portugal. So, what does the Portuguese royal family do? They pack up everything, the entire court. We're talking up to 15,000 people. And they flee across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro. Can you imagine? This one single act just completely flips the entire colonial power dynamic on its head. Suddenly, the colony is the capital. And this sets off a chain reaction that basically makes independence inevitable.
And you can see the difference right here.
It's a tale of two Brazils. Before, as a colony, trade was restricted. There were no universities, no printing presses, nothing. But once the royal court arrived and Brazil became a united kingdom, bam! Trade opens up, the first universities are founded, newspapers start printing. You see, the old logic was pretty simple. An uneducated, isolated colony is way easier to control. But once they opened that cage, there was no way they were ever going to close it again.
So, independence. Happy ending, right? Not so fast. In fact, independence didn't bring stability at all. The next century and a half was a complete political roller coaster. Just this constant, often violent struggle between having an empire, a republic, a democracy, and a dictatorship. It was just one coup after another.
And this timeline really shows you that pattern. Look at this. In 1888, slavery is finally abolished. Brazil was the very last country in the Americas to do so. And then, just 1 year later, the empire falls in a military coup. Then you get the rise of Getulio Vargas in another coup. And then the big one in 1964, a US-backed military coup that leads to a dictatorship lasting more than 20 years. It's just this cycle of abrupt, often military-led change.
And this is why figures like Getulio Vargas are so fascinating and so controversial. This is a guy who was, for all intents and purposes, a dictator. He admired European fascists. But at the same time, he's the one who introduced major workers' rights, public education, and health initiatives. He's not a simple hero, and he's not a simple villain. He perfectly embodies the deep contradictions that are just at the heart of Brazil's entire history.
Now, that military dictatorship that started in 1964, that was a really dark time. We're talking torture, murder, people forced into exile. And it's important to remember, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of this much wider Cold War strategy where the U.S. was backing anti-communist regimes all across Latin America. It led to this terrible period of repression and human rights abuses that really scarred an entire generation.
All right, that brings us to our final section, forging a modern nation. And it's all about the weight of history. When democracy finally returned in the 1980s, it felt like Brazil could finally start building a new future. But it was a future that was still, and is still, deeply shaped by the immense weights of everything that came before.
And one of the first things they did was create a new constitution in 1988. And it is, to this day, one of the most progressive constitutions in the entire world. They call it the Citizen Constitution for a reason. It was designed specifically to prevent history from repeating itself. It's a direct, deliberate response to the trauma of the dictatorship. It explicitly protects indigenous rights, women's rights, freedom of speech, everything. All in an effort to build a more just and inclusive society.
So that really brings us right up to today. Modern Brazil, its identity is this incredibly complex, beautiful, and often contradictory tapestry. It's woven from all of these historical threads we've talked about, from the indigenous heritage that started it all, the deep African roots from the millions who were brought here against their will, the European colonization, and then all the waves of immigration that followed. It's all in there.
And so, we're left with this final big question. Brazil's past was so overwhelmingly defined by exploitation of its land, its resources, and its people, all for the benefit of outsiders. So what will define its future? That's the real story here. The story of what this incredible nation will become, well, that story is still being written.